Hey, Sam here. Welcome to another Vinyl Tab. I don't do these enough, but I don't know. It's been a while since I've done one. But yeah, back for another. Talk through some records I got. Mostly stuff I bought recently. I've kind of held off on doing this one specifically because there was one record that I've been waiting to get off from mate that I want to talk about without parents shouting at me specifically. I'm sure if you've paid attention to the podcast, you probably guess what band that is. But we're going to start with that record. And that record is Sinners Never Sleep by You at Six. And not just any version, it's the 10-year anniversary edition. Basically, this is a triple LP version of that album. Arguably the best at Six album. It's kind of that or the debut. But the last album that kind of felt like kind of universally liked by people who don't just still stick up for at Six like myself. But yeah, I mean, 10 years old this album. That already feels kind of crazy to me because I'm buying it the day it came out and going to a signing in Manchester to meet the band because I like at Six back then a lot more than I do now, and I still like them a lot. But yeah, I like this album a lot. There's, the vinyl. It's a grey pressing. This was done, like I say, 10-year anniversary of this album. They decided to actually finally give it a vinyl release because it never had one before, because 2011 was, prior to vinyl blowing up. But this album, I still think it's, for 2010's Britrock, it's kind of as good as you could get with that sort of stuff, really. And again, your tolerance of that is going to vary massively depending on how you feel about it. Like for myself, someone who likes it, this is the high bar. For Perrin, who would probably lump that 2010's Britrock as the worst thing to ever happen to music ever. Of course he's going to hate it. But this album, it's got bangers. Simple as that, really. And Loverboy, Jaws on the Floor, Bite My Tongue. Like, it's a funny album, because I remember when it came out and they're like, yeah, there's going to be songs with Ollie Sykes and Winston McCoy, and everyone was kind of like, oh my god, Six are doing a metalcore album. And then it was this, and they had guest spots, and it was like, yeah, what did you expect? But, yeah, so this version, it's got the album, a banging album. And then the second LP is basically a bunch of acoustic versions, demos, B-sides, the stuff that only a really sad Six fan would probably want to check out, and that's probably me. I was kind of curious to actually hear what some of these demos are like, and some of them, there's a one of the demos on this album, Brother, I think it's the one it is actually, probably could have got onto the record and been a pretty good song for Six standards. I think like it's a kind of underrated, lost little gem they've got tucked away there. The acoustic version of No One Does It Better and Loveboy, they are acoustic versions of Six songs, no surprises there. There's these alternative mix versions of all the singles on this record, which are quieter. Like, I don't know what the point of those was, but, they had to fill a second LP. And then the third LP on this is a selection of songs taken from when they headlined Wembley Arena for the first time. Is it the only time they've headlined Wembley Arena? They've done arenas, but I don't know how many times they've done Wembley. But yeah, when they did that whole Final Night of Sin Wembley Arena headline show, which I never actually got to go to, but it's pretty good, the live versions of it. So yeah, that's why this album kind of got like the 10-year anniversary vinyl treatment. And like, again, regardless of your feelings of Six at the time, this album was a legitimate like big deal in terms of like putting them at the very top of like the 2010s Britrock scene before it all started to kind of start crumbling down in the years prior and the years following. And Six is kind of the band who have endured that that whole process. And again, probably just easy for me to say, and the new Six album, I don't have on vinyl yet. I don't know if I will get it on vinyl. I don't know if I like it that much, but it's the best thing they've done possibly since this record. Definitely like since the one afterwards. But yeah, I just thought I'd get a chance to talk positively about a band I like that Perrin hates, and not have to feel like I'm like having to be on the back foot defending them, and I can actually be like, Six are good. And again, like this album, it's got Reckless on it. Like, if you're going to tell me Reckless ain't just a pop punk banger, then you're lying, because it is. And Time Is Money with Winston McCall does go hard. It does, I promise. Yeah, we'll follow up with one of the albums I bought this month. My current favourite album of the year so far. I'm sure it's probably not going to come as a surprise if you've listened to the podcast what that is, but it's This Is Why by Paramore. I basically went out and bought this from Banquet Records on the day it came out, because they were like, yeah, if you come in and buy the Paramore record, you can get a free Paramore tote bag. And I'm gay, so I kind of had to go for a free Paramore tote bag, really. But yeah, this album is fantastic. We talked about it a lot on the podcast, raving about how good Paramore are, what a great band they have become, how they, of all the bands from their scene, they're the ones who have endured and are still putting out the best music. This has become, like I say, probably a top 3 Paramore record for me already. I'm so in on the sort of post-punk version of Paramore because they've done it in a way that is true to them and still really musically interesting to me. And it's also not just them doing a post-punk record. There's lots of other little bits here and there they've sprinkled in to create a record that is really just unique to them, unique in their catalogue, and stands out loads. So like the vinyl, it's a clear pressing. That was one that the UK sort of indie stores got. And yeah, I've been listening to this a lot so far this year. It's when you know that I really liked on first listen. Like I say, I went out and got this day it came out because we'd had the album for a little bit by that point. But actually, no, because we reviewed it afterwards. So I'd only heard the single, so I listened to the album once and I was like, and then I saw the tote bag thing. I was like, yeah, I'll go get that because it's a really good album, and I'm gonna be sticking with this album an awful lot over the sort of coming months, and particularly when I'm gonna be seeing Paramore live next month, I'm gonna be listening to it even more. I was like I say, I feel like this is an album that is coming quite universally liked. Actually, I was initially wondering if it was going to be quite divisive, but I don't know if Paramore fans are just so in on the band now, and maybe the people who don't like it are the not Paramore fans. But yeah, this is Why by Paramore. It's a great album, as me and Paramore have already extensively covered on the podcast. Go listen to it if you haven't. Next up, we're going to talk about a band that, again, that I have raved about to no end, that parents raved about, that everyone has raved about because they're one of the best bands in the world right now. They are a hardcore band who have blown up into a way that few hardcore bands possibly ever could imagine of. And that band is, of course, Turnstile. But the record I'm going to be talking about is going back to arguably their breakthrough record, which is Nonstop Feeling, which I've had this is one of those albums that I remember when it came out, I didn't get this right away because I was kind of like, at that point, I was in my really edgy mosher phase where if I was going to listen to a hardcore record, I wanted it to be really hard, and this was kind of a bit too fun for me, I guess, at the time, and I was just like, I don't want to. I was sneering at it a bit, and then I heard people raving about their live show, so I was like, well, when they come to, I missed it a few times to come to, but then they announced a Flying Cock show in Kingston, which is the best venue in Kingston. It's just the coolest little dive bar, so I was like, I'll go to that, and then I was just kind of like, my mind was blown seeing them live, and it was on this record, and I was just kind of like, oh man, I was so wrong about the Turnstile, and then I went back to it and I've just loved it ever since. And then basically this was another one where I saw Banquet Records had got it in after it'd been sort of not around for ages, and I was like, I can finally get Non-Stop Feeling in my vinyl collection because it deserves it. And again, like most people when they rave about Turnstile now, they are talking about Time and Space and Glow On because those albums are undeniably the biggest things that Turnstile have done that have really taken them to new heights of popularity and creativity. But there is something about Non-Stop Thing laying down the ground for that, of this like legitimately actually hard sort of low end hardcore with this 90s funk and alt rock kind of Red Hot Chili Peppers, Faith No More bounce, and then bits of emo on songs like Blue by You, which I for years felt was a bad song. And I'm like, no, it actually is a good song. But just me being, fussy. But when you just have this album open with Gravity, and that opening sample that kickstarts Gravity will always get me just so pumped. And then when that actual like drum beat kicks in before the riff, and I'm just like, no matter where I am, I'll just start bouncing because it's that good. And then when we finish Gravity and you go straight to that blast that is Drop, and there's a reason why like a lot of these songs have endured in the set list, especially like Drop and Gravity, Phased Out. Like that opening run of 3 songs is so good, and it just kind of just doesn't let up. It's just all just like power, bounce, drive, like. And it was one of those where you kind of go like, when you actually see them live, you go, oh, they do literally just like recreate the live show, the album. They are one and the same. It is, the energy is undeniable across both. And I think it's great this album hasn't kind of been forgotten about after how much the other two have blown up in like the aftermath of it, because like undeniably this is, you could say by terms of quite primitive compared to the insane like leaps into pop music and stuff they're doing on Glow On, but there is just such an undeniable like energy that to Non-Stop Feeling that just hits the spot whenever I listen to it. And so glad to finally have this into my record collection. Next up, we're going to kind of move into pop terrain for a little bit, because there was an album that, like, I like quite a lot of pop music, and this is one of those albums that kind of straddles the line between pop and pop punk and rock music a little bit, which it's a weird one, because it feels like I've always wondered why the album is the new Power Waves album, Unwanted, for those of you, you can see when I was saying it backwards. But yeah, Power Waves have been one of those bands that have kind of like straddled the line between being a pop band, but Krang and Roxanne have kind of dabbled in covering them. And then I was going to point, was like, well, looking at some of the pop music that like they cover, which is really even more poppy than what Power Waves are doing and less interesting, I was kind of surprised that it took till this album for like alternative like rock press to actually decide, oh, you know, we should probably start covering Power Waves, because this is just a like naughty sort of pop punk band, but it's way better than, say, you know, what the modern Avril Lavigne albums are, or like any of that Mod Sun, Travis Barker school of ick. This album, it's just really high energy, kind of like bubbly pop music. It's a really nice pink pressing. I do love that. I'm always a fan of a bright pink pressing. But this is, you know, really sort of bubbly, bright pop music with massive choruses. It's loads of fun. They kind of ditched the sort of new wavy goth stuff that they had on the debut now in favour of more like contemporary influences. But I've got just a lot of time for Power Waves, and I know that they're not really a band we're going to cover much on the podcast, because even though Rock Press has sort of started to give them the time of day, I don't like. There's other stuff that we're going to be on the podcast more interested in covering, but I just sometimes I think it's good to use these vinyl taps to be like, this is some of the stuff I listen to that I'm not going to get to talk about on the regular show. And we'll follow that up with one other pop album, which again is Rina Sawayama's Hold the Girl. This is one of those pop albums that actually I know a lot of listeners are well into, because it's brilliant. Like, this was one of the albums that, particularly, and her last album, were like really raved about in like alternative circles, despite being pop music. This is, I'd say, more pop than the last one, because, you know, the last one had like the kind of the new metal-y guitar stuff. There's still bits of the metal and like rock stuff on there, but it's kind of more unashamedly pop. But this album is excellent. It's a red pressing. It's very nice. And it's when I was like, I feel like we didn't give enough time again, like, because I know like a lot of you listeners and out there really liked this anyway, and it was like quite high up in like as far as non-rock and metal albums go on the album of the year polls, because it's excellent. Just like really fun, really creative pop music, and I'm just so here for that. So yeah, Rina Sawayama's Hold the Girl. Next up for me, I'm going to talk about, just again, one last little talk about my favourite album from last year, which is Blood Command's Praise Armageddonism, which I bought on vinyl as a birthday present. And I just love this album, and it's one I keep still going back to on a regular basis more than any other album from last year. I've been talking about until the end of your podcast, where I was like so torn between this and Brutus being my album of the year, because that Brutus album is still incredible, but it's the fact that I just go back to this album so much. Whether I'm like out and about or I'm at home, I'll stick this vinyl on. We've got another pink vinyl. I don't just buy vinyls if they're pink, I promise. But this album, it is everything I love about music. It is poppy, it is aggro, it's catchy, it's creative and forward thinking. Nikki was just such a incredible blessing to this band. Like, Blood Command have been fantastic since 2013. 2012 was Funeral Beach. Whenever Funeral Beach came out, I can't remember off the top of my head now, but they've been that good since that album. And I think this is just, this is their best album. It is lightning, like, just energy. It's so excellent. And again, it's built off the core of what they've done before. And Ingve, I think, is just one of the just like genius songwriters at the moment, who just knows how to write a perfect pop chorus with a punk energy and bounce, and they're just dropping disco beats all over it, and just having so much sort of boundless creativity in a band who don't want to be confined to just being a punk band or whatever. Like, I wouldn't call Blood Command a pop punk band, because like pop punk is a whole different thing, but like this is the best example of fusing pop music and punk music you can possibly get, really. I've raved about this album quite a lot, so I just wanted to give it one last quick shout out on here and just be like, yeah, I have got the vinyl because it's excellent. Next couple ones I'm going to talk about before we end up on my usual. Here's some non-Grebo video game soundtracks or whatever. Just a couple of records that I bought towards the end of last year. Albums from last year again that I talked about that I really like, kind of similar to what I've done with the Blood Command there. Is we've got the Counterparts record, which again I liked this when we reviewed it, and it has really stuck me to the point. The Eulogy, for those still here, I can never remember the title off the top of my head because it's their title's always quite long and wordy, but this was one that really did stick with me a lot more than I kind of thought, because I used to love Counterparts. That's the vinyl. It's like a red and black, not splatter effect, but whatever they call that one. I used to really love Counterparts. Then I felt like I started to grow out of them because there was other metalcore bands coming along doing a similar thing but more exciting. And this album actually felt like Counterparts kind of stepping back up to be at the level of those bands. And I don't know if I'd say put this on the level of like a Vane or Sea Space Cowboy or Dying Wish, but it is good to see the band who kind of were really influential in getting me into a lot of that kind of like more classic sounding metalcore revival stuff, the Poison, the Well Worship, that they could still step up and match the more exciting new bands who are doing it. Again, it's a really like deeply personal record for the band. I think that helps so much in lending credibility to this music because it's all built off all of that emotion and capturing that. And this is what the record does. And yeah, again, it's one that I didn't actually think I'd be going back to nearly as much as I have ended up doing, but really has connected with me. I think like Whispers of Your Death is one of the best songs Counterparts have done, and it's got just loads of really just, if you're into what Counterparts do, I don't see why you wouldn't consider this to be one of their strongest records, really. It is very good. And then the last sort of rock record we're going to talk about is The Wonder Years, The Hum Goes On Forever. Which way is the correct way to hold this record? Because it's confusing, because the album title is upside down, and then the thing is, yeah. I love The Wonder Years. I don't know if you knew that. This was high up on my album of the year list because it is excellent. This album has been an album that bounced The Wonder Years back. You know, it's nice blue marble effect, whatever, splatter. And this was just the perfect kind of like, let's get The Wonder Years back on track after, like, I mean, Sister Cities is an excellent record. I will stand by that, but I understand it was divisive for reasons that pop punk fans are babies, is why I'm going to go with the reasons. But this record felt like the perfect kind of like, oh, we're going to get The Wonder Years back on track and get people to invest in this band again and care about them, because let's just basically do what we do on Sister Cities, but bring back some of the stuff that people complained about was missing without regressing, while still, again, finding sort of new avenues to push our sound into. It's a really impressive album in that regard. Really personal, emotional pop punk songwriting with like Soupy doing these like tugging on his shirt, heart and sleeve songwriting. One of like that legitimately like heavy songs they've written in songs about death, which again, much as Perrin sneers about it, I get to talk about these without Perrin shouting at me. That's half the reason why I like to do these videos by myself. Like, Perrin can't shout me down and be mean about bands I like, because he is a big meanie. Songs about death, you know, it's kind of them doing a sort of doom song within the Wonder Years emo, like, sad framework. It's excellent. The Wonder Years are great. This album, again, of course I was going to get this on vinyl. Like, it was one that I was like, the moment it was out, I was like, I've got to go and buy that on vinyl because it's going to be one of my favourite albums of the year. And I still listen to it an awful lot, and you should too. Last two records, then again, we've kind of done enough Grebo stuff and a little bit of pop music. And again, you know, I always like to kind of wrap up and be like, hey, I like other things, and end on my like sort of soundtracks section. So I'm going to double up on two video game soundtracks that I like listening to this time. One of them, I'm sure I haven't talked about this before already, but again, this might be where I bring this up and be like, Sam, you've already mentioned this on a previous one, but Paradise Killer, I feel like I haven't talked about this one yet. I might have mentioned like the actual sound of it before, but it's kind of like really kind of like breezy synth pop, like kind of bit of jazz. The game is like this sort of noir detective thing, but with like a kind of anime neon soaked aesthetic, very 80s. It's very cool. And yeah, it's a great game with an incredible soundtrack. That again has a nice clear pressing that I have listened to. Like, this is kind of one of those I'll stick on if I just want something that is really chill. I kind of compared it. I think I brought this up when I talked about when we talked about the Turnover record from last year on the reviews. The kind of like electronic, really lo-fi bits on that very much remind me of this. So if you dug that, this is the sort of soundtrack that would actually sound pretty cool to you. Yeah, it's a great game as well. It's a really unique detective, investigative like game. That's very cool. And the last one is I'm going to talk about one of the greatest game soundtracks of one of the greatest games ever, which is Final Fantasy VII. This is one I've had. This was the first video game soundtrack I ever bought years ago at London Comic Con when I saw that Square Enix had in their booth the soundtrack for Final Fantasy VII, which is, for my money, a perfect video game. It's a double LP and it's like picture disc. Again, I don't really go for picture disc much, but when it's the Final Fantasy VII soundtrack, I'm going to, make the exception. There's like the different pictures are all key art from the various games, from the various like cutscenes in the game. It is such a like wonderful soundtrack, this video game. It's like the original version, not the remake, but it just iconic. You probably have heard like One Winged Angel before at this point. Like, it is that much of like a recognizable bit of video game music. I love Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy VII is one of those games that really changed like my perspective on what video games can be. It's a classic for so many reasons, and this is, having the soundtrack of vinyl. Like, I'm pretty sure this is actually quite rare nowadays. So that about does it for another one of these vinyl taps. Kind of blasted through stuff a bit quickly this time. I feel like I've not got as much, really interesting and niche collector stuff as some of the others have. So I'm just going to talk about like, hey, here's records I bought and here's stuff I like. But I hope it's still kind of worthwhile and getting to talk a bit more about records. I got to talk about Yumi at 6 this time and not be shouted at. That's the important part of doing this video. And hopefully I'll try not to leave it so long before doing another one, and I'll find some other more interesting kind of deep cuts in my record collection. That'd be fun to talk about. But hope you enjoyed it. Catch you next time.